spring webinar series. A series revolves around visual history, and over the next few months, we will hear from historians and designers who will speak about their experiences using visuals to share Canadian history. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I will be your host. Over the next hour, Charles Howe will a variety of exercises using visual primary sources to teach historical thinking skills. Before we begin today's presentation, I would like to provide you with a quick introduction to Canada's National History Society. Canada's history is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through publishing, education, and recognition programs. If you are interested in knowing more about or subscribing to our flagship publications, Canada's History Magazine and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids, please click on the links on the screen and save them for later. A reminder that the deadline for the Government of Canada History Award for students and teachers is April 23rd, 2016. So if you started an application or your students have started an essay for that award, now's the time to be thinking about finishing those up and submitting them. If you would like to know more about these awards and our other award opportunities at Canada's History, you can follow the link on the screen. To ensure we have the best possible experience today, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer is currently running. Not Adobe Connect, obviously, because that's the one we're using today. But if you have a bunch of Excel pages open or Photoshop going on, you might find you have a better experience after you close them. However, if there are issues and say, for example, you're listening in at school right now, school internet generally reconnects about every 10 to 15 minutes, and that might disrupt your experience. And that's okay because we record all our webinars and they are available on our YouTube channel only a few days later. And if you've registered for the webinar, you will get an email telling you when that recording is available. If you are on social media, we would really like to encourage you to share and spread the word about tonight's webinar and all our webinars, in fact. If you want to start an online discussion there, we'll be watching and sharing and retweeting your comments and thoughts and ideas. So get on that if you choose to. I have provided Canada's History's Twitter handle and Facebook link, so if you don't already like or follow us, you can do that as well tonight too. So this all brings us to questions for today's webinar. If you have questions or you have comments to make about the presentation, Charles and I encourage you to use the chat box at the bottom right-hand corner, as that is the best way for us to communicate, or for you to communicate with us. Chances are we will use our microphones to communicate with you. And if that's okay with everybody, I don't see why we should not continue with today's webinar presentation. So Charles Howe taught social studies, law, history, advanced placement, and international baccalaureate courses at the junior high and high school level in Burnaby, BC for 34 years. Over the years, he has compiled several collections of primary sources and co-authored books on the Riel Rebellion and Canadian political cartoons. He also worked with a group of BC teachers to produce the Big B Canadian History Contest, which ran for 20 years. Since the contest ended in 2013, he has reworked the Big B Contest Society website to provide teachers with a database of primary sources on a wide variety of topics. If you haven't seen it already, the link to that is in the description of this webinar on the upcoming webinars page. I will also share it in the chat box later on during the question and answer period. It should also be mentioned that Charles was the first recipient of the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching in 1996. So with that, I would like to introduce everybody to Charles Howe. I will upload your presentation, Charles. Please introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi everyone. I hope you can all hear me and I'm not too loud. I've given a lot of workshops, but I've never talked to a computer before, so this should be interesting. First cartoon, I guess, shows you need to have critical thinking to survive in our society, or you should have it. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience or my conversion to primary sources. When I started teaching, I didn't use them, but it didn't take long before I started to. This is the textbook I had when I started in 1965. This was my only resource. I had a wall map. We had an opaque projector, which was pretty useless. We didn't have any way of reproducing primary sources, basically. Sorry. There were some visuals in this book. Actually, it wasn't that bad a book compared to some of the other ones. But this was a typical visual. I'm not quite, pretty hard to get students excited about the Riel Rebellion looking at this. The caption underneath it was typical in those days. They basically gave you the answer. You wouldn't have to read the book. They've laid it all out for the students. And that's the whole idea behind the textbook, is basically it did the thinking for the students, and their job was to memorize it. One of the best resources I found very early on in my teaching is the students found political cartoons interesting. But all the textbooks that were produced at that time used the same cartoons over and over again. There were about 10 of them that seemed to fit into the textbooks. And I was kind of naive. I thought, well, I guess Canada never had any political cartoons, or they would use some different ones. This was how social studies was taught in my first school. It was basically lecture and regurgitate. That's the way I was taught at UBC. We had someone lecture to us, and we read the textbook and we regurgitated. The professor did the thinking for you, and the textbook did the thinking for you. At UBC, I had a major in history, but I don't remember ever using any primary sources, so I certainly didn't know how to analyze them. And very early in my career, I realized that this was not the real world. The real world, the significant things in the students' lives involved trying to make sense out of newspapers and things like that, and how to vote. And somebody didn't do the thinking for them. The first school I taught at, this was a typical exam question, regurgitation. At the end, we had 3 grade-wide exams a year, so you had to follow the textbook. And after each exam, I went down to the principal's office, and I wanted a permanent contract, and it kind of depended on how well my students did on the exam. So that's the way it was taught. This didn't really please me, though. I lived in Vancouver, and I taught in Burnaby, and I had to drive quite a ways. And I used to pick up hitchhikers. And when I picked them up, when they found out I was a teacher, that was all right. But when they found out I was a social studies teacher, every one of them groaned out loud, and I'm not exaggerating. So I decided I better find out what was wrong. What was I doing wrong in teaching history? I didn't want to spend the rest of my life boring students and making them groan. So I went out to UBC and I started reading and finding out what is history all about. That was the best quotation I found. History is all the remains that have come down to us from the past, studied with all the critical interpretive power that the present can bring to the task. Well, that's not the way it was taught to me, and it wasn't the way I was teaching it. Obviously, you needed primary sources and evidence. One thing I did learn in the methods course at UBC was a man by the name of Jerome Bruner, and he said the structure of history is what's really important. The ground rules and procedures of history is what we should be teaching. The problem was no one seemed to know what the structure of history was. But if I was going to teach it, I was going to have to figure that out myself. So I read about history for a couple of years, and then I summarized it to the students. or something that I could use with the students to explain to them what I was doing in class. The way it was taught normally was you read someone else's, what their conclusions, or you listened to a lecture. What I found history was about, what I consider the structure, is really the historical method. Historians start with a problem, and they have to gather evidence, then they have to examine it. They go through a number of steps, and then they write their own history. So I was all inspired. I'm going to use primary sources now. Okay, well, here's the problem. Why use the historical method? I think these should make sense to you. Knowledge transmission, it means everything has been processed for you. They've done the thinking for you. This is what you have to do. It was very superficial. It was kind of easy. It was boring. History was closed. Everybody thought the textbook was the only answer. Students just sat there and listened, and history was dead. I felt that if I could find the right primary sources, I could get the students to construct their own knowledge, do their own thinking about historical problems. They could analyze sources. We could look at things maybe in a little more depth. Hopefully you could find sources that disagreed, and that would make it more interesting and challenging. History would be open. There would be multiple answers. The students could do their own interpretations. And I could use primary sources to spark interest in the course. And my goal, my mission in life now, I want students to think that this was the most popular subject in the school. Well, all the primary sources in those days, and literally every one up until I think it was 1990 before I saw one, this is typical. It was nothing but print. There weren't any visual sources at all. And so historians seem to stay away from them. The sources, it was 100% written, and it was for years. The documents were too long. They were too complex. They were government sources or political or constitutional history. If you really want to bore students, give them constitutional history. The documents were designed for academic, probably because somebody took a university book of primary sources and tried to apply it to high school students. The biases were very subtle, too subtle for the students I had. They had to be pretty obvious. They reinforced what was in the textbook. If you read the primary source, guess what? You found out the same information in the textbook. The sources were all reliable. They'd eliminated any that weren't. That was sanitized, like the images in textbooks were really sanitized. You had one perspective, and I found this was pretty deadly. Well, what was I looking for? Well, I wanted written and visual primary sources. I knew my students preferred visual. If I were using written, I wanted something shorter and far less complex. I wanted everyday sources, the kind of sources that students would run into in their everyday lives. I wanted them to be age appropriate so they could read them with the vocabulary wouldn't overwhelm them. I wanted sources that had really obvious biases so that the students would have something to think about. I wanted multiple perspectives, not a range of views, not just one point of view. I wanted them to not always be credible and reliable. Let the students figure that out. And I wanted to include, this is sort of off that, but I wanted to include marginalized groups like women and First Nations and labor and ethnic groups and things like that. And I wanted it to be lively. The problem? Oh, sorry, if I was going to teach this way, if you looked at that diagram I gave you earlier, all the historical sources, the people who created them had a point of view. So you have to detect the bias or point of view in the documents. And then historians have a perspective or a point of view. And sort of a mixture of all of these things make up your point of view. So I confront this directly. I call it biases. Some people think their points of view, they mute it, but that's part of life. And guess what? The bias rule says every source is biased in some way. Documents tell us only what the creator of the document thought happened or perhaps wants us to think happened. As a result, historians follow the following guidelines. View every piece of evidence critically. Consider the creator's point of view. Well, I had to start experimenting with primary sources, and basically I had to create my own sources because there weren't any that I could use. One of the first things I did was I came across with the potlatch. That was the first set of documents that I tried to create. George Clutesy had visited a class when I was working on my master's degree at UBC, and I was really impressed, and he just written a book on it. And it got me into Victoria, and it got me into an archive. As a history student at UBC, I never went to the archives. I'd never been to one, but got me over to Victoria. Unfortunately, there weren't very many visual sources that I could use, but I tried very hard to find different points of view, and it was very easy with the potlatch. The missionaries had a point of view, kill the potlatch. The Indian agents wanted to kill it. The Indians eventually started to speak out on their own behalf, and what I call non-Indian sympathizers. And I used to divide the class up into four and give them four very biased points of view, and we had a debate. And then the next day, we would sort of go through it and find out why people had such strongly different points of view. I was starting to learn how to analyze sources, but I wasn't very systematic about it. And I learned the importance of bias. The missionaries, even after I went through and explained where the missionaries' biases were coming from, and looked at all 4 points of view, when I asked them to write an essay, the missionaries would stick with their point of view. So you don't want to just read one newspaper. You're going to end up adopting a point of view, probably. Another set of books another book that I worked on was one that contained different types of primary sources. I wanted them to use different types. Each type of source has its own characteristics and its own reliability, and it was necessary to deal with them. Another set of documents I worked on was selecting a capital for Canada. This was kind of interesting. There were 5 biased points of view. Each city was asked to write a 2,000-word essay explaining why it should become the capital of Canada. And what I found really interesting, they all claimed to be in the exact center of Canada, and they all claimed to be the easiest defended site in Canada. And so the students had to work through this, but I had 5 rows in my classroom, and each row made a presentation to a student that I picked to be the Queen, and the Queen could decide where the capital of Canada was to go. But unfortunately, these documents were kind of written in Victorianese and were a little too difficult for the students. And it wasn't a very good example of using primary sources. The documents were too long, too. One of the most successful things I ever did was take students to Victoria to debate whether BC should have joined Canada or the United States. I did a lot of research in the archives in Victoria at UBC and the Vancouver Public Library. Now I realize the documents were too long, but it was the students had a lot of fun with it anyway. They got information so that they could go to Victoria and debate. We did a little skit on the front steps of the Victoria. So here's Mother Britannia trying to grab Miss BC, and Uncle Sam trying to grab us too. But we then went inside and we did our debate in the one of the committee rooms. And this is where the original debate was held. It was a great day for the students and for me, but not a particularly good use of primary sources. Documents were, once again, were too long. Another way of using primary sources was getting the students making an historic film. In British Columbia, one of the things I found amazing, and there isn't a single school in BC named after Sir John A. Macdonald. Well, that's very strange because Macdonald had a lot to do with the history of British Columbia. So I had the students research Macdonald. What's the BC connection? He was elected as an MLA in Victoria in 1878. and he visited British Columbia in 1886 after the railway was completed. Here's a photograph of the students reenacting MacDonald driving the last spike in the Esquimalt to Nanaimo Railway. Kind of interesting. We went to the archives when we were doing our research, and I found the people in the archives were very helpful. They weren't used to having students in the archives, and they found it kind of fun, and sort of went out of their way to help us. The other thing that is that this engineer, he stopped the railway at the exact spot, made everybody else wait while we went out and did our filming. When you're doing a film, all sorts of doors open for you. The most challenging film we ever did was, I taught in Burnaby, and no one knew who Burnaby was, including me. But on the 100th anniversary of his birth or death, I forget which, the city was offering money for people who were coming up with creative centennial ideas. I said, well, if you give me $5,000, I'll do a film on the life of Burnaby. Well, much to my surprise, they did. And so we had to research his life. He's probably the most boring person I've ever researched. But this was a challenge. How could we bring this man alive? And it was one of my students who came up with the idea. There were no women in his life. That's one reason why he wasn't all that interesting. But one of my students said, well, that's because there were so many women and they couldn't mention one. The other ones would feel bad. And I thought about it. Well, we know you can't prove us wrong. You can't prove us right either. And so we had a lot of fun making this film. The girl on the left was the director and the key person in this film. And if I die tomorrow, this photograph really pleases me to see just how excited she is and how proud she is and what she has done. And if primary sources can help us achieve that sort of thing, it's a lot better than memorizing textbooks. Another idea I came up with was hiking historic trails. Harrison Lillooet, if you look back at the diagram, physical remains are an important part of learning history. And about 30,000 people all hiked this particular trail during the gold rush. And so I thought, well, that would be a good idea. Why don't we do it? So we started at Port Douglas, which is at the head of Harrison Lake. It's about a 35-mile lake. And we landed right here in Port Douglas. Here it is in 1864. The next slide shows what it was like in 1976 when we started the hike. The hike was so much fun, we did it for the next 30 years. We actually camped in Port Douglas on our first day of the hike, and I had the students find the remains of the courthouse where Matthew Bailey Begbie held his very first trial in British Columbia. This trail was used by Matthew Bailey Begbie, A.C. Anderson, James Douglas, Billy Barker, Caribou Cameron, all the big people in the early history of BC. So we took the students hiking. Where do primary sources fit in? Well, if you see the students are holding a book of primary sources. We had to find the trail the first year we went on the hike. So that's what, anyway, that's not what they're doing here, but they're talking to one of the First Nations at Skookumchuck, which is found partway along the trail. And we always had a First Nations student speak to the students because we were on their land. And we wanted to learn about their culture. One of the turning points was, though, I decided that one year I read Desmond Morton republished the transcript of Louis Riel's trial. And there was a group in Vancouver that was offering money to teachers who could figure out a way of teaching law in their classrooms. And I got my hands on about $6,000, and they didn't really explain how I could use it. But what I did is I put all the names of my class in a waste paper basket, and I pulled two names, these two girls, and we flew to Ottawa for a week to research the trial, see if we could find the original documents, and so we could prepare a trial. Now, believe it or not, these girls, we worked in the archives until 1 o'clock in the morning, and then we went back to the Rideau Canal and skated back to where we were staying. But the exciting thing was I found out in Library Archives Canada a wealth of material. While the students were doing one thing, I went off and did some other things. And I found a lot of visual resources that I'd never knew existed, or I didn't know how to access them. But I'm learning. Now, when I came back to Burnaby, how do I get students excited in the mock trial of Louis Riel? Well, here's how I did it. Here's a map of the Northwest Territories in 1886. It's a year later than I wanted, but each dot, I think, represents 1,000 or 10,000 people. The rebellion took place at Batoche, and you'd think that when the trial of Riel took place, you'd think that would be in Batoche. You're going to be tried by your peers, normally. But the people in Prince Albert were a little annoyed that the CPR didn't put the railway through their town, and they were maybe a little too sympathetic to Riel. So MacDonald thought, well, I'll try him in Winnipeg. So he started from Batoche on the direction of Winnipeg. But then he thought about it. There's a problem with Winnipeg. There's still some people there that might sympathize. There's still some Métis living in that area. And plus, if he tried them in Winnipeg, which was a province now, then they'd have to have a 12-person jury. But if they tried the person in the Northwest Territories in, say, Regina, you'd only have a 6-person jury, so that would reduce in half the potential people who might find Riel innocent or not guilty. Now here's a primary source. This is the jury panel that was set for Riel. 36 names, voters. So you'll notice there aren't any women on the list. There aren't any First Nations, and there aren't any Métis. Well, sorry, there is one. The second one is a Métis, but his wagon broke down on the way to the courtroom. So anyway, I looked at this carefully, and they have something called townships and ranges. Now, if you came from Saskatchewan, that would mean a lot to you. But anyway, I gave the students a map of Saskatchewan with all the townships and ranges on them. And I asked the students, I want you to plot where this jury lived. And this is what they'd come up with. Riel his jury panel, he's tried in Regina, so they're close to Regina. They're also very close to the CPR. My conclusion is that, okay, Riel has a 6-man jury. They're white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and they're all recent immigrants from Eastern Canada. Not a very good thing for people in Western Canada would not like that jury. And so I thought, there weren't any women on the jury, obviously. Well, what happens if there were women on a jury? Or there weren't any women witnesses. There weren't any First Nations witnesses called. There were very few Métis witnesses called. What if you had a 12-person jury, male, female, and you brought in all the witnesses and you put all the facts on the table? How would a jury find Riel? Was he guilty or not guilty of treason? So we ended up in New Westminster Courthouse. They opened up the courthouse to us at night, and we gave Riel a trial. Now here's where I really learned a lot about analysis here. There's a great deal of similarity between a courtroom and historical analysis. I used to tell the prosecution, you should be able to convict Riel by this document alone. It says, justice commands us to take up arms. He signed it. It's a signed confession. It should be a cakewalk to convict him. How could you possibly miss? But of course, the prosecution would ask one set of questions, see what they could find in that document to support them, and then the defense would come up with a different set. Like the prosecution would ask, well, what is treason? Well, taking up arms, okay. Who signed the document? Well, Riel signed it. Why did these people sign it? Well, he obviously talked them into it. Who was the leader? Well, the leader is obviously Louis Riel. But the defense would say, what is justice? What does that mean? Who signed the document? Well, it's more than Riel. There's a whole bunch of people signed this document. His name is down at the bottom. Who was the chairman? Well, it wasn't Riel. It was Pierre Parenteau was the chairman. What does ex-ovide mean? Louis David Riel, ex-ovide. Well, he means one of the flock. So he wasn't the leader. He didn't consider himself that, unless you considered that he made up this document, so distant case. Why did he call himself David? Was it David and Goliath? Did he see taking on the Canadian government, something like that? Anyway, it's very interesting how you can interpret a document two different ways. One of the students, my top students, loved being lawyers. They would do anything to wear one of these robes. And this woman, Peggy, she's became a lawyer and worked in Calgary. A lot of my students became lawyers, I think. I got excited. The students really liked the trial. They liked getting dressed up. And I thought, well, I'll write a book. It should only take a year. Well, it took my wife and I 5 years. Just about killed us. But in preparing the book, I went to Glenbow Archives plus the National Archives. And in our book, every single page has a visual source in it. People used to tell me it was too expensive, but we did a book, and it's just loaded with visual primary sources. I'm starting to learn how to analyze, and I guess I better get moving here. It's really important to analyze sources. Like this source. What does this show? Well, apparently it's supposed to have something to do with Poundmaker. It's a complete fabrication. And if you go through and ask the questions, you wouldn't want to use this as a source to show what happened. This cartoon points out that the media are very good in blowing up events and exaggerating them to sell. But if you want to know what really happened during the rebellion, here's Fort Pitt. Defenseless, basically. It's surrounded by 250 warriors who have just killed 9 people at Frog Lake. Inside the fort are people from Fort Pitt and from Frog Lake who managed to escape. A lot of women and children. And the police are there as well. They've moved away from Frog Lake to the safety, supposedly, of this fort. But there's a problem. The natives will be killed, and people in this fort will be killed if it goes to war. So the Hudson's Bay Company factor, who got along with the natives, went out to negotiate with Big Bear. And the interesting thing in the middle of this, his daughter jumps over the fence and goes out to see how her father was doing. And these are the people, it's horrible people that supposedly had just killed the people at Frog Lake. But anyway, they negotiate. And guess what the deal is? It could only happen in Canada. It would never happen in the United States. The women and children decide they'd rather live as hostages with Big Bear rather than stay and fight it out with the RCMP. So if the natives said, well, we'll let the RCMP escape if you'll become hostages. So that's what they did. But of course the media, and that first cartoon was what set it off, was they assumed the worst of the First Nations, that they were going to be raping the women and who knows, scalping them, doing all sorts of horrible things. And so one of the neat things that came out of it is the Teresa Gowanlock and Teresa Delaney had to write a book about their experience, and they explained that they hadn't been mistreated by the First Nations. It's still kind of negative against First Nations, but none of the terrible things happened that they thought were going to happen. So be careful with primary sources. Here's one of the ones that taught me just how important it is to source a primary source. What does this show? Well, it shows immigrants, all right, and Johnny Canuck is having them sing. Kind of interesting how the Russian would know English, and some of the other ones would know English. But where? Well, it's in a wheat field in Western Canada. When? It's 1903. So this is right in the middle of the biggest immigration movement in Canadian history, organized by Laurier. And the interesting thing, this would be the equivalent of like 2 million immigrants arrived in Canada today. That's what was happening. People were absolutely scared. But you also had who published this? the Minister of the Interior, of course, was, I forget his name, Clifford Sifton. And Sifton was trying to get people to come to Canada. Why? Well, because he wanted to settle Western Canada. The interesting thing in this diagram, there's a lot of missing people. If you look at it carefully, you'll notice that just about everybody comes from Northern Europe. There's no one from Southern Europe. There aren't any women coming to Canada, apparently. And there's no people from Japan or from India or black people coming from the United States. Why use visual sources? Well, you can read these. If you have any questions, you can ask me about some of them, but it's easy to come up with multiple perspectives. I like cartoons because they have a really strong point of view. And you can get lots of variety, so students don't get bored just doing cartoons. You can use all sorts of sources. And I found that all the students could say something about the sources. You could ask the easiest questions to a student, maybe who is having trouble, and then really go after the top student to get them thinking about what they're looking at. The other thing that happened, this is about midway through my career, I'm determined I'm going to use the historical method. I now have a lot of experience with the archives. The other thing that really happened was the technology started to take over. We had overhead projectors and photocopiers. I was able to give every student in the class a copy of a cartoon if I wanted to, or put it on the overhead projector. I started going out to UBC and finding more and more visual resources to use in my classes. Computers came along, and we'll see the exam bank, garbage in, garbage out, and it became very clear that we were only testing the very low-level thinking. The internet, of course, gives us even greater access, and the PowerPoint, I think every student teacher should be forced to use an opaque projector for a year before they get a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is absolutely phenomenal. Anyway, I wanted to teach a variety of skills. Our teacher's guide gave us 100 skills to teach, but we were only examining a fraction of this. The other thing that happened around this time, I started teaching at Burnaby North, and I started teaching advanced placement. And the way they examine at the end of the year, it tested all of the skills I was trying to teach. The problem, of course, they weren't Canadian, so I had to create my own. Canada's National History Society, I was fortunate enough to get on the board of directors, and they had meetings, 3 meetings a year at different places across Canada. I was able to get access to a variety of archives. The other book that really woke me up was this one by Peter Desbaretz and Terry Mosher. I had no idea that Canada had political cartoons until I saw this book. The problem was they weren't teachers, though, and they weren't looking for multiple perspectives and the kind of sources I was looking at. So I spent the next 20 years going through every newspaper published in Canada, trying to find the best political cartoons for teaching the way that I thought was really important. Here's an example. The best thing that I found was Teaching Confederation. This was the sort of resource that I had when I started teaching. Really hard to get students interested in dead white men. I mean, the most interesting thing is McDonald's wearing white pants. But look what happens when you get political cartoons. It turns out Confederation was controversial, just as controversial as everything else that's happening in Canada. And it was just a lot easier to teach about Confederation when you had some political cartoons. And I'd never seen any of these reproduced until I did my research. Oh, I'm not going to talk about these. You can look at them if you're interested. What I found interesting when I did these first book of political cartoons, teachers asked me to produce a teacher's guide. And I think it's because they were as poorly prepared as I was. They weren't taught to using primary sources when they went to university, and the methods courses, the early ones anyway, certainly didn't teach us how to do it. And of course, the great thing for me, if you want to learn something, try writing a book about it. So I read everything I could about political cartoons, and anyway, this book sold really well. Teachers wanted the help to learn how to do this. And the most exciting thing I found were the cartoon devices, because here's the information students can use to find the biases. The way they draw is reflected in cartoons. Here's one of the exercises, signing, how cartoonists use arms and legs and expressions and things to communicate quickly. Another thing that happened around this time was math teachers at Burnaby North, where I was teaching, they had a math contest in every grade. And the students were excited and interested in their exams, unlike the exams we were giving the students. And I was at a school that had 2 grade-wide exams a year. And anyway, I wanted to test critical thinking questions to challenge myself. And so we came up with the Begbie Canadian History Contest, thanks to the PSA that provided us with some money, and a group of mostly retired teachers who helped me with it. We tried to come up, why did we pick visual? Well, because we don't have a national curriculum in Canada or a textbook that everybody uses. It's taught at different grades. So the contest focused on skills and major events. Documents were very short. That's the influence of AP. They contain multiple perspectives, a variety of primary sources, grade level appropriate sources, interesting and provocative sources. And it was kind of subversive because these exams went into the schools. The government has lost control. They can't really control what teachers are using in the schools. I think textbooks are starting to catch up with us. But anyway, in this, I've put everything online, all the questions we used in 20 years. So if you want to take a look at it and see how well we did and see if you can do better, have a look. On the web page, I've also included the historical method and teaching ideas and themes and questions. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to move a little faster. Here's just some ideas that I think it's revolutionary now. If I were teaching today, I could just teach it in a totally different way. The teachers can go through the First World War, for example, and pick cartoons that are left wing, right wing, emotional, not emotional. They can pick them by region, and you can get the students to try and sort these and explain their rationale for doing it that way. If you want, I've got photographs of all 5 statues of Riel. You can do the 5 W's if you want on these statues, or here's a suggestion. 5 statues of Riel, which is the best, communicates the best? Is the candid photograph candid or posed? Why was the photograph taken? Very interesting. Photographs are fascinating. Paintings. What's the paintings are, artists can spend a lot of time thinking about what they're going to do, and the way they draw, there's a reason for it, and you have to sort of figure it out. It's kind of fun. Newspaper, magazine, 1940, 1946. What's the difference? Well, in 43, we wanted women in the armed forces, and 46, we wanted them in the home. And look how the magazine covers changed. Posters. There were people who supported Jewish refugees coming to Canada. But anyway, you can get the students the sorts of posters on the webpage, and you can get the students analyzing them. The documents, I don't have that many written documents because it takes time to produce them. You can in the Begbie contest, there's about 20 examples of essays using these documents. You'll find they're like this. They're very short, they're very biased, and I found students they need something to chew on, so you've got to find documents. People don't realize it, but it took me a month and a half, at least a month or a month and a half to come up with one essay topic with 10 primary sources. So each source has a strong point of view. If you're teaching the First World War, got a wide variety of sources you can pick from. There's a variety of topics. Just pick whatever you want. I think the most common way to use these primary sources would just be one. At the beginning of a class, when students come into your room, you could be showing them one, and the students know you're going to analyze it. And it can get them out of physics or math or wherever it is and into your classroom. You can use the sources at the beginning of a period, at the end of the period, or the end of a lesson. You can give it as individual, group, classwork, homework, just a whole variety of ways you can use them. My most recent book, which I just finished yesterday, bouncing back and forth, 15 Ways to Interpret the Past. One of the most interesting things I did in my teaching career was, if you look at the diagram, interpretation is really important. And so what I did is I researched the 15 most popular ways of interpreting Canadian history. And students can get good enough. So if you give them something like this, they can, is this good versus evil? Okay. Religion coming to Canada, obviously good. Is it the struggle for survival? Well, Montreal was very precarious, and Maisonneuve had to really struggle to keep it. Is the fall of First Nations and the rise of the French, the growth of freedom. France was a very autocratic country, but in Canada you had lots of room, and it was hard to maintain that. Progress is building a city. Is that progress? The British, sooner or later, they're going to be after this, the St. Lawrence River. Anyway, you can go through all these ways of interpreting, and I think sort of enrich the student's understanding of any resource you use. Just a final one, and if you have any questions, try this one. It's one of the best assignments I ever came up with. Ask your students to write a history of a member of their family or a friend or a neighbor, and include some primary sources. Anyway, that's pretty well it. Thank you for joining me, and I'd be very happy to answer some questions if you have any.
Thank you for walking us through all the ways and the importance of using visual sources when teaching history, Charles. I think it's an important lesson just to be ingrained into teachers. It's definitely not something that was used all the time when I was learning history in grade school and high school, and now learning and teaching history myself, not in an official capacity, but through Canada's history. Visual sources are the bee's knees. So yes, if anybody has any questions at this time, now is the time to share them. We have a short amount of time left, so if you do have to run at the 6 o'clock mark, you're obviously welcome to, and you can catch the answers to the questions during the recording. I think we'll take a few questions, and if Charles doesn't mind, I will start them off, because I think this is a pretty pertinent question to do with curriculum today. So the current movement in social studies is to teach the big six historical thinking concepts that are being promoted by Tom Morton and Peter Seixas. How do you think your ideas about the historical method fit in with theirs?
I see a lot of overlap. When you select a subject for investigation, for example, I consider that historical significance. You want to pick one that's really interesting, and your perspective will help determine what you do. The historian, the second thing an historian does is collect evidence. Well, certainly you've seen evidence of that today. And it also involves historical perspectives, because you have to evaluate where your evidence is coming from. You analyze evidence, well, historical perspectives. You select evidence, historical significance. The book on Louis Riel that we did, I really learned a lot about selection. You select. You can't tell everything about Riel's life. So why do you pick what you pick? And our book it's written by a teacher. No one else has written a book on Riel as a teacher, I don't think. And you can see my teacher background all over that book. The political cartoons, I looked at millions of cartoons. Now, why did I pick 360? So, significance is really important. The whole purpose of history is to make sense out of it. And so that's where continuity and change and cause and consequence come in. When you interpret it, I think that's the historical perspective and ethical dimension. I think that's where it comes in. So I see a lot of overlap between their approach and what I call the historical method, because they're dealing with history, and that's what the structure of history is all about.
Thanks, Charles. We have two questions from Ashley and Evelyn. Ashley asks, do you find it takes a long time to get students comfortable with political cartoons?
It depends on the grade level. I started using political cartoons when I could take them out of the newspaper and make an overhead projector image and show it to them. And if you work with them and teach them the devices that cartoonists are using, they really enjoy it. And one of the best exercises I gave the students was I'd get 30 different cartoons, say, dealing with Confederation, and ask each student to analyze and give a report to the class. And they could do it. They could give you the context and explain it. And then I could add in if they missed any points. And what I really liked, sometimes the students saw things that I missed because they're analyzing for the first time. So I think they can do it. When you get into the grade 11 and 12 level, depends if teachers have taught them, but they catch on really fast.
Ellen asks, do you think it is better to be an unbiased historian or a biased historian?
Well, I mean, good historians try and keep their perspective under control, but the most interesting books that I've read are those the 15 interpretations, like Donald Creighton's book, The Empire of the St. Lawrence. Is just wonderful. It just flows, but he doesn't tell us everything about history. He leaves out Western Canadian history, and he doesn't talk about labor. He doesn't talk much about women, but there's a flow to his book. And I know what his point of view is and his interpretation. I just find it very interesting how he interprets information that's quite different from someone like Garneau or someone like that. So I like a strong point of view, but really biased history is not very good history. You've got to analyze and pick something that's reasonably representative.
I would agree with you, Charles. I also think that there's the element of letting your students know that you are biased in a way and letting them use that as a judgment for learning from you. What do you think about that?
Well, that's interesting, Jessica. I would always start the year by telling the students what my biases were. And I said, watch out. My mother was Scottish background, my father was Danish. So the students learned a lot about Bering and Alexander Mackenzie, and it's hard. You can't eliminate your biases.
We have a few more questions and comments. Charles, are you seeing the conversation that's happening in the chat box?
No, I'm not. So you can repeat the question. You have to repeat the questions for me. I don't know why.
Okay, no problem. Evelyn commented back, personally, not having a bias allows historians to look at evidence with a blank slate. Cynthia has a question. She is wondering, have you ever tried comparing past political cartoons with current cartoons, and how does this work out?
Oh, that's kind of interesting. Yes. One of the things when I did the books of political cartoons, you try and pick cartoons that are relevant. And the comment I would frequently get from people was, well, these are the same issues we're dealing with today. So you can look at gambling then and gambling now, or prohibition then and our drug wars now. And yeah, it's a great way to look at them. You want to keep it relevant, you should do that.
So I have a question, another question for you, Charles. Oh, actually, I'll let Evelyn chime in first. She says, or she asks, do you find past political cartoons to be more subtle than the current ones?
No, all cartoons are never subtle, or if they are, they're not very good cartoons, and they're kind of boring. No, cartoonists are very one-sided. Duncan McPherson said, they present issues in black and white. They take a side and exaggerate it and hammer it home, and that's what makes them such a great source with students because they are so biased. The students can have fun detecting the bias and trying to figure out. Well, that challenges the students. That gets them thinking about the topic and, well, is he right? And if you can show a cartoon that shows the opposite point of view, the opposite extreme, then they have to decide for themselves on the issue.
So I'll follow up with a question that is just as challenging for students, I think, and that is, do you think publishers should include politically incorrect sources by today's standards in their textbooks?
I think they're going to have to. We can no longer, with the internet, you cannot control what students are looking at. If there's one subject in the school that should be teaching students about perspective and biases, it should be social studies. That we should be taking a leadership in that. I mean, look, there's a lot of stuff on the internet that could get students moving in the wrong way. They have to learn how to think for themselves. So I think that's should be our main motive. That's why I think critical thinking is a really important part of social studies today.
I completely agree. When I first was thinking about it, I was saying to myself, well, that's just, going to confuse students. But no, you're right. They need to be challenged, and that's one great way of doing it. We have one more question from Deanna, and then we're going to wrap up. And she asks, did you ever use trips to museums to help your students form their opinions? If yes, how did you work in that?
Oh, early in my career, I took students to museums. Um, but to be honest, I guess in the latter half of my career, I didn't take them to museums. I found museums could be a bit tame, and I found other ways to get. I don't know if you noticed in the slides, doing filming and hiking and things like that. You can't do everything, and it's nice to take people on location to where history took place and deal with something there. But the new museums are becoming, especially in Vancouver, very creative and much more provocative. But good museums are full of primary sources and the variety of sources, especially objects and artifacts and things like that you can't get exposure to. I visited Quebec once, and the teachers had turned one classroom into all sorts of artifacts donated by people in the community, and it was just a really interesting source. They'd created their own museum, really. So yeah, you can see a lot of things. We've got a great museum in Vancouver for looking at different types of sources.
Museums are also great for being critical of perspectives, and the museum is writing the text for those panels, and I thoroughly enjoy walking in there and talking to myself and challenging almost every sentence that's written on there. It stimulates my historical thinking and makes me happy, really.
I think they're getting better and better at it now, too.
I agree. Thanks, Charles, again for answering questions and your entire presentation.
Well,
And
thanks everyone for joining and participating. It's my passion, Canadian history and visual sources.
I'll echo that. Thank you everyone for tuning in to tonight's webinar about visual and written primary sources being used to teach critical thinking. I am sending out a link now to the feedback survey. So if you have 5 minutes to complete that as you're exiting the webinar room, that would be great. If not, maybe tomorrow you'll have some more time. That helps us give you better webinar series as we move on and explore different topics. And finally, in less than 2 weeks, Bronwyn Graves and Rebecca Benson from Historica Canada will present Aboriginal Arts and Stories, Uplifting the Stories and Visions of Indigenous Youth. So if you haven't already registered, please do so. And Charles, I don't think you can see it, but everybody is saying thank you very much, and they really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks very much, Jessica, for hosting it.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Have a great night, everyone.